Around the end of October this year, a major discussion began at the behest of the MTG Commander player base, being literally asked by Wizards of the Coast about a rules change to the Commander format that, well, I'm going to try to avoid throwing a bunch of terms at you when describing, because I know a significant portion of people who wind up on my videos wind up here not really knowing anything about Magic, but somehow being interested in hearing me yap. So, Commander is a format of playing Magic the Gathering that uses a deck of 100 cards, which all need to have different names and have one card, the eponymous Commander, a legendary creature or card, but that's not important to the video for now, that exists outside of the main deck to be cast at any time. The important thing for this discussion is that this Commander dictates what cards you can put in the deck through the use of color identity. Basically, what colored mana symbols are on the card, either in the cost, somewhere in the text box, on the back of certain cards, stuff like that. Color identity is essentially the discussion being had here, which leads me to another concept in the game. Hybrid mana. Hybrid mana is a mana cost that can be paid in multiple different ways, normally having one or two different colors that you can cast it with. The current rules for hybrid mana are that for the purposes of color identity, you can only use it in a commander deck that uses both of those colors. Or, well, all of its colors in the case of the hybrid card with more than two colors in some fashion. Which is where I can get into what Wizards asked. Hey guys, what if hybrid cards could count as either color? So, this is being painted as a new discussion, but it's actually not. In fact, Wizards has kind of softballed this question towards the Commander Rules Committee in a way before when they designed the extort mechanic for Gatecrash, a mechanic they outright said was intended to make the CRC ask questions about, well, admittedly, what they said it was about was mana symbols and reminder text, but to claim that the fact that they actually use the hybrid symbol for that reminder text has no effect on bringing forth this discussion feels a bit disingenuous to me, now that it's being brought up overtly within a year of Wizards taking formal control of the format, headed up by the guy whose literal second set on the design team was the exact set where Extort was originally printed. But that's not really the important part of this discussion. The important part, at least in terms of me in this video, is how do I feel about this? Well, the short answer is pretty much the same short answer that almost everyone has given. No. This is fixing something that isn't broken. Might take a little bit more nuance than that. If they actually went through with the change, I'd still bitch about it being unnecessary and stupid, but at the same time, I wouldn't call it the death of the format. Well, except, actually, for the proposed part of it, where cards that are hybrids of colored and colorless mana functionally have no color identity anymore. That one breaks the game in my eyes. The article where this question got asked in the first place claims some reasoning that, well, doesn't really make a ton of sense to me. I think the number of people have gone through this reasoning, along with other elements of the reasoning found elsewhere, with enough of a fine-tooth comb for me to not be needed for that part of the conversation as much, but there's elements to the reaction I do want to delve into a little bit deeper. See, part of that reaction is exactly what I said about a year ago when the dissolving of the Commander Rules Committee in favor of in-house Commander management from Wizards of the Coast was announced. See, the next major set, Lorwyn Eclipse. It takes place on a plane that has a mechanical identity heavily associated with hybrid mana costs, and in fact, is using them prominently. So, you know, people seem to be under the impression that the reason Wizards wants to make this rule change is to push that set, which means that, yes, we have people basically going the route of saying that it's nothing but greed leading to this decision making. Okay, so for one, they literally made a rules change to Commander that let vehicles and spacecraft be commanders, didn't ask anybody about it. So there's honestly precedent to say if they really wanted to do this out of greed, they just announced the change instead of asking. And it's not like I don't think the design elements of Lorwyn Eclipse fueled the desire to discuss it. It's very clear that they did, but I have a hard time buying into it being a greed thing, or at the very least, only a greed thing. There's been other indications through podcasts and whatnot that the real reason seems to be that they want Universes Beyond cards to be more accurate to the original IP, and the hybrid change somehow helps them do that. To be honest, first thing that comes to mind for me is this mattering for Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, an actual set that we know is happening, by the way. There's probably going to be a card on screen from it. But if you have specific exceptions you want to make to color identity, you could just print that shit on the card. It's really not that hard. You printed exceptions to the rules of only having one commander on cards with partners and backgrounds, so why not do it here? Breaking the default rules is exactly what the card text is there for. I think one of the biggest things to this from Wizards that's grinding a lot of people's gears is that this is a restriction to the way deck building works in this format, and while lifting that restriction provides more creative freedom for the deck builder, having some restrictions is good, as long as there's flexibility in place to allow for creativity to still occur, and in some cases more of it, since we're figuring out how to operate around these restrictions in order to still make something that does the thing we want to do while still working within the restrictions. Okay, now somebody tell Glaive Keo that. Yeah, like, I'm gonna be real, another part of the reason I'm so late to covering this is because I was supposed to be taking a break from scripted content, and was a little worried I didn't have a full video's worth of stuff to say about Hybrid Mana, but the parallels are striking here. Really think about it. We've got a game whose audience is telling them to leave a deck building restriction in place, and then on this side you have somebody calling a partial team building restriction bad. Like, there's more criticisms that Glaive Keo gives that are, well, both good and bad, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Who the fuck is Glaive Keo, and what the shit am I talking about? So Glaive Keo is a gacha game YouTuber who primarily covers Genshin Impact and Wuthering Waves. I know that really doesn't narrow it down very much, but that's the most basic summary that I can give. There's plenty of people that dismiss him as chiefly a gacha drama channel, and while I can see that to some extent, to be honest, it's not really true. He doesn't really cover community reactions to what's going on as much as he covers what his own thoughts on the games are. I'm all for that criticism, and to be honest, there's plenty of good points the dude makes in several of his videos. One video, for example, that actually is more so about the community reaction, is his video titled, Why They Are Terrified of Wuthering Waves. It correctly points out several examples of the Genshin fans basically coming up with exclusives to shit on and dismiss Wuthering Waves on Twitter. But that's not the video I'm talking about. I'm talking about his video on Genshin's 6.2 version, which is already out by the time you're watching this. So this video was pretty fucking bad. It was coming up with a bunch of inane reasons to shit on what is actually a pretty good version update, albeit with some real criticisms that are worth bringing up sprinkled in. This video is just the start of the timeline here, though, but I do actually have to begin by going into what my problems with Glaive's original video are, and I'll address any response to those problems as we go along, because some of the problems are things that he just owns up to being wrong. In fact, we're gonna start with one of the most direct things that Glaive Keo openly admitted to being flat out incorrect, and I'm going to play him saying it directly.
Now let's talk about the cost of nostalgia. We need to talk about the timing. If you look at the history of Genshin Impact, the X.2 patches, the ones that come right after the initial hype of a new nation wears off, are usually pretty quiet. They are kind of like the filler patches where we save our primo gems and maybe do a festival event. But looking at the 6.2 special program, it feels like someone at Hoyoverse looked at a chart, saw player interest dipping, and smashed the big red button.
So elements of this are going to be relevant to what he got wrong literally a few seconds later that actually did go completely unaddressed, but I want to talk about the thing that in his apology he actually addressed most directly, and that's saying that most X.2 patches are low height filler patches, and well, Keo's own words were to call it objectively incorrect.
In my last video, I made a specific claim about the history of 0.2 patches, calling them filler. Looking back at the timeline, Dragon Spine in version 1.2 and all of the 0.2 versions going forward, that statement was objectively incorrect. I was wrong. The truth is, I allowed the absolute drought of version 6.1, which by the way, statistically had the lowest event count in the game's history for the 0.1 patches, to color my view of the entire cycle. And maybe you don't feel that way. But with me not liking Miliastra Wonderland, and with no regional expansions either, I projected the dryness of the last 6 weeks onto the last 5 years. And that was a lapse in judgment, and that is on me, and I apologize.
Okay, so first of all, one thing to point out, Glaive apologizing for making the mistake is a good thing, but I do want to talk about how this happened so that Glaive can prevent a mistake like this one in the future. I kind of make a meme out of the fact that I tend to be late in covering things, and now you guys have a better idea of why I wind up late to cover things most of the time. I don't want to bring out head-ass takes that either age like milk or were already incredibly wrong, and that's what Glaive should be doing here. In the beginning of his original video, Glaive pointed out that he wanted to have an honest and level-headed discussion. But if you're admitting that one of the first things you had to say was completely false due to your own emotional bias of the situation, that's not a level-headed or honest response. And all it would take is just a couple seconds of research, or even just paying attention to the fact that you start calling 1.2 one of the best updates in the game's history seconds later to find a different approach that's more level-headed but still gets the point across you want to make, especially if the overall point is something you stand by so strongly. But I think we do need to talk about that overall point, because I played the beginning where he brings up the cost of nostalgia for a reason. Because the core of why he brings this up is to indicate that because the game is usually less active, they put more of the overarching lore into the version to generate hype when it otherwise wouldn't be there. This is me paraphrasing him, not stating my own thoughts. Like, I know I'm kind of still on the last point when I say this, but people painted this factual inaccuracy as a minor issue when it's actually the crux of the why for his entire nostalgia bait point. But that's, like, not the only thing with the nostalgia bait point either.
Because what we just saw wasn't a standard update trailer, it was a lore nuke. I mean, think about it. For 5 years, literally half a decade, Alice was just a voice coming out of a gramophone or a name on a travel guide. Nicole was just a mysterious voice in our heads at the end of the Fontaine Archon quest. These are characters the community has been begging to see since the game launched. And suddenly, with zero warning, here they are in 3D, walking, talking, and fully modeled. Dropping them now isn't random. It's calculated. It is a move designed to generate peak hype during a time of year when the game usually sleeps.
Look, it's technically correct to say that these characters have been part of the lore for 5 years, but show up now during this patch, but to say it's out of nowhere is also objectively incorrect, since we saw splash screens depicting both of these characters before 6.0 even had the name Luna 1. It's especially untrue in the case of Alice, since Dory throughout her appearances in the Archon quest before 6.2 has been heavily hinting that her mysterious supplier she keeps talking about is Alice, which is confirmed to be the case by the end of 6.1. Nicole is a better example. We haven't done anything in the story to hint at Nicole being in Nodcry yet, but now she's here. But for Alice, it's just plain not true. But he does go further with the explanation than just this.
They know exactly what they're doing. And then there is Durin. If you're a veteran player, or if you have just been around long enough to hear the stories, you know that version 1.2, the Chalk Prince and the Dragon, is widely considered one of the best events in the game's history. It is the good old days for a lot of people. By bringing Durin back to Mondstadt, giving him a human form, and tying his story to Albedo and Klee, the developers are using your nostalgia. They're taking your fondest memories of the early game and selling them back to you as a new feature. It is smart. It is incredibly smart, but it is also a bit of a magic trick. Take a closer look at the trailer again, okay? It looks crowded, doesn't it? You see Varka, the missing Grandmaster everyone has wanted since launch. You see Columbina, the Damselettes finally taking center stage. You see the release cast from earlier like Llama and Nefer and Flins. The trailer builds an illusion of a massive roster updates, making it feel like the game is exploding with new options. But look at the banners, the actual list of characters you can pull for. It is just Durin and Jehoda. All of those heavy hitters, Varka, Columbina, they're just there to look ready in cutscenes. They are the carrot on a stick. The developers dangle them in front of you to keep you running on the treadmill, promising that maybe next time you will catch them. But for now, they just want you to stay logged in.
So much of this is just completely ridiculous for someone who's been paying attention to the Luna storyline. Columbina literally yeeted Rerir into the Phantom Zone at the end of 6.1. What do you mean, finally taking center stage? All of these characters have been in the story for several versions and were part of the hype for the entire story quest. Varka straight up is one of the catalysts for the whole story quest and was in game in the last version after 6.0 basically just went, oh lordy coming. Columbina has been part of the story since the beginning. The previously released playable characters just didn't fucking disappear. Like, I don't know why you're thinking this as painting it as a massive roster update, when the way the vast majority of these characters are getting shown is by way of participating in the fucking festival they're putting on in Nodcry. When they're Nodcry characters. To me, it feels like you're saying that characters appearing in the story before they are playable is transactional. And I think you're wrong on that front, but I can't really prove that because, yeah, there is the potential for dangling a future character you may be interested in front of you to be something just keep you invested so that you'll part with your money when the time comes or keep engaging with the product. But it's also something good for the storytelling of the game. You said yourself that the story department is knocking it out of the park, and yet for some reason the story elements that are being knocked out of the park are also being painted as predatory in nature. I mean, I guess that's technically true, but, well, there's a hypocrisy to that when it comes to Glaive praising Wuthering Waves. Not saying these practices are negative when Wuthering Waves does them, but saying it with Genshin. Look, Shorekeeper was in the first cutscene of the entire fucking game, and we technically see them before we see the main character. And it's a regular occurrence for characters to be part of the story as much as 3 versions ahead of becoming playable, even if characters like Lupa and Cantarella didn't get a treatment like that. Hell, we've got the new Federation, an entire region that has 1, technically 2, since Verena's actually originally from there, if you actually look into the lore. Characters in 1.0 we're still only getting hints about. I'm just saying, if we reach 6.0 and we haven't gone there yet, I'm just gonna start calling it Snezhnaya. But let's move on. This will probably be easier for me to simply talk about rather than playing what he actually says. Simply put, he does not like the Hexerai system for these buffs because he feels like it restricts teammates, with his primary example being Albedo's new buff that gives him an indestructible version of his flower, requiring your team to have 2 Hexerai characters. Something that is chiefly relevant with bosses, and from my years of playing with Albedo, is actually worked around through simply placing the flower away from the enemy in most cases. Let's start with this making the character useless because, I mean, it's a little bit more of an actually point on my part to in part debunk it, because it is a point of frustration and something that I'd rather just not be the case when it comes to specifically the flower, because of the way that it actually gets put onto the field. Like the other old Geo constructs, it's a lot clearer when you're getting into that hitbox. But it's not really a death knell to me, since it means that he's more useful against groups of enemies rather than against large enemies or bosses. Hexerai Venti still has this kind of weakness against large enemies and bosses, in fact, but I'm not really seeing anyone comment on him being weaker. But units that are more valuable against groups than against individual enemies is a role that a character can have and still be fine. I mean, I don't want to harp too much on comparing to Wuthering Waves, but in Wuthering Waves, that's just a Whimpering Waves character. Kinich is actually a good example of this the other way around, though. He murders boss health bars, but his damage is a little bit clunky when having to shift from enemy to enemy with group targeting. Even back in the 1.x days, Venti was just not used against bosses, typically, because his grouping ability wasn't going to work, and without it, there were better options for Animo debuffs as well. But Albedo is getting a buff, and that buff is tied to a faction-based system for character boons based on having characters of the same faction on your team. The reason I call this a faction buff and not just straight up say Hexerai every time is because it's not actually the first example of it. Netlin had it for every fucking unit, and Ascendant Gleam with lunar reactions is, you know, basically that. Glaive straight up says that this prevents people from making teams that they want, teams that make sense in his words. And with his big example for Albedo being that having another Hexerai ruins his synergy and prevents you from making the team that you want because you want double Geo. Which is a team building restriction built into the game that buffs characters based on having two characters with a particular tag on the team, which is somehow fine for Glaive, but you know what? Never mind. Let's dissect this particular example a little bit closer. Okay, so for one, Albedo doesn't actually care about the Geo Resonance effect. It buffs shields. If buffing shields matter to Geo characters, we'd be running them with Elemental Mastery, but we don't, because it doesn't. But let's say that you do. Maybe you're planning to use that Crystallize as your primary sustain, and you want those shields to be as strong as possible. If your goal is to bring Albedo with Hexerai buff and still get Geo Resonance, then you still have one completely free slot to put whoever you want with. For the sake of example, let's say Albedo and Durin are your Hex characters. You bring Ito as your other Geo because you're a big dumb idiot that likes to break things. Or maybe Navia, since you're getting the most out of Crystallize reactions is so important to what you're trying to do. Well, Durin has a mode where he wants to vaporize or melt. Maybe you use Farina for that? Maybe you want a Geo buffer to go with Albedo instead, and you're after a Hydro or Cryo main DPS. Cool. Skirk is right there, Nublet's there, Ayato's there. Lots of options that way as well. And the Geo buffer could be Goro, Yunjin, or Chiori, depending on where your playstyle is going. You could even make it Mualani and Kachina if you wanted. Go for a hybrid Natlin and Hexerai type of thing. Hell, there's a whole different playstyle to Durin, but let's swap out Durin for Mona, because you want more of the old school characters. You can still use the options I was talking about, but instead of focusing on getting a Hydro character for Durin's damage buff, you get a Pyro character for Mona's Vaporize, which there's a lot of sub-DPS characters that do that, since this is in theory going on with Mona as an on-fielder, but I want to talk about the actual on-fielder application of this strat in the form of Linny that seems particularly interesting to me, since you'd actually be getting stacks of Linny's buffs, swapping to Linny, hit a charge shot, repeat the process. It's still a little clunky to control, but certainly would function, especially once you learn the rotation well. Not to mention, gonna be honest, with you doing an attack sequence and then switching to another person to do an attack sequence, sounds kinda like a hot swap Ruwa rotation. Which actually sounds really fun. This is pretty much me operating on the theory crafting level, but I think you see what I mean. The creativity is still there. To be honest, I think the talk about a lack of creativity and talking about being behind in the end game stems from something that I actually do want to make a video about. Well, technically another video, because I already touched on it when talking about Stygian Onslaught. And that's how the end game seems to take these restrictions that breed creative team building and push them to their breaking point. The problem in Glaive's case being that he seems to blame the restriction on the team and not the restriction that the boss, especially the fucking crab, provides for this issue. And, well, see, that's why me bringing up hybrid mana is such a big part of this. Hybrid mana didn't really exist before Commander, but it did exist before Wizards of the Coast codified it as an official format. And the ruling on it was created by the players that hybrid mana counted as both of its colors instead of only one of them. Just its color identity itself was a restriction created by the players to create this new format. The restriction limits card availability, yes, but the key here is that it's not so restricted as to build the team for you. I actually critiqued Night Soul for being too onerous by actively discouraging units from outside of Natlin from taking part by locking the best buffs behind having 3 units. And there's an element of that with Albedo's kit, since his Hex buff actually buffs the damage of specifically Hexerai characters. But having a 2-of faction system, for me at least, is a good solution, and to me, Glaive is basically the guy saying that hybrid mana should count as either of its colors rather than both when it comes to deck construction. This kind of thing happens all the time in both MTG discourse and, well, the gacha games that are more traditionally referred to as gacha games. Magic the Gathering is a gacha game, whether you like it or not. And it's definitely valid to critique Albedo not getting as direct a buff as he should get, even if I don't agree that it's as doom and gloom as Kyo's tone made it sound like. Whatever, he doesn't like these buffs based on having two characters with the same tag. Whatever, he's probably just making it sound like more of a crisis because it's easier to get engagement that way. Hell, he even said part of his tone was burnout, and I get that. It happens. I don't necessarily agree with all the backlash either. I point out how much of this was a continuation of the story of 6.1, sure, but I wouldn't call him a tourist, someone who doesn't play the game, because he got a few facts wrong. I'd say he just wasn't paying enough attention when he did play is all. You can talk about being level-headed with your criticisms all you want, but saying you're level-headed doesn't make you immune to an emotional response, which is what Glaive admits to giving. And I'm sure some of you could claim that I'm emotionally responding to Glaive, not liking things that I do like. But if it stopped here, I probably wouldn't name Glaive in this video and just talk about why I like the Hexeride buffs, and I certainly wouldn't be doing it in the first half of December in a video this fucking long when I'm supposed to be on break from this shit. Alright, let's talk about what makes somebody hypocritical for a second. Bran Online is another gacha YouTuber and streamer that oftentimes reacts to other more scripted videos. In January of 2025, he got a lot of flack, and deservedly so, for criticizing how predatory the Moeka and Sid Lolly double banner was, followed by spending money to C6 Moeka, max out the character. He owned up to his mistake, apologized for the lack of good judgment in that situation, and has moved on. He reacted to both of these videos, and at a certain point, his reaction to Glaive's explanation of his actions became much more critical. And, well, there is a reason for that happening.
While I accept the criticism on my history and my tone, there is one narrative going around that I need to shut down right now. The idea that I am a tourist, that I am an outsider who doesn't actually play the game anymore and just here to farm drama. Now let's look at the receipts. Because in version 6.1, the very patch people claim I didn't play, I spent $1,000 to C6 Nefer. I streamed the Miliastra Wonderland for hours. And I don't say this to flex, I say it to make a very specific point. At tourist visits, I live here. I have a crippling gambling addiction. I am the one funding the server so free-to-play players can enjoy the game. So when I criticize Genshin, I am not doing it as a hater looking in from the outside. I am doing it as a high-investment customer who wants the product to match the price tag.
So this is where Glaive's criticism starts to look weird. First, I think I want to address that whole I pay for the servers thing. This is something that Genshin content creators have been blasted all over every social media on the planet. Pretty sure some of the callouts somehow managed to get on tout for this exact wording, and Glaive can just say that as a defense against a bad take. Let me just address this as though it's a real argument real quick, because it takes like one sentence to do so. Spending money doesn't make you not a tourist. By definition, the people who live in the place the tourist is visiting, in this case the developers because it's their fucking house, are trying to get money out of tourists. A recent example of you dropping a thou on this game doesn't prove shit. You streaming Miliastra Wonderland kinda does, but it's not like I personally actually thought you were a tourist. Anyway, just letting you know that saying you spent $1,000 on Nefer doesn't prove jack shit to me about if your passport is from Genshin or just has a fucking stamp. Realm Wars could have started playing the game in 6.1, C6 Nefer immediately, and it wouldn't make him not a fucking tourist. The non-gacha audience is not gonna know who the fuck I'm talking about. Go watch Spiffy Needle Geeks. I run D&D there. I run Fabula Ultima in the Genshin setting there. Okay, so now that I've covered that, I just want people to look at this from Brand Online's perspective again. So Glaive called out the practice of having 2 character faction buffs as a restriction that shouldn't be in the game. Meanwhile, spends $1,000 on a character that functions on a 2-character faction buff. Glaive called 6.1 a dry patch and says how bad it is directly led to burnout. So fucking bad that he, in his own words, projected the last 6 weeks onto the last 5 years in a scripted video. It's the patch he dropped $1,000 on. He calls Durin a solution to Albedo, the only viable solution in his eyes, while dropping a C6 14th Doctor on a character that is seemingly only good if you have another recent limited 5-star. And no, Saint Tontas, the fucking Mawika banner being more predatory does not mean that Glaive's not hypocritical or doesn't deserve to be called out for that hypocrisy, because that's not what hypocrisy means. But you know what? I'm gonna be fair. Glaive did give his criticism after pulling Nefer, so let me back up. Maybe he just has buyer's remorse after seeing how bad the rest of the patch was.
Alright, jokes aside, on the surface, her design was well received. She is elegant and looks cool, but digging into her actual kit reveals a design choice that the community started to call synergy gating. Basically, it is the idea that a new character is intentionally designed to be significantly weaker unless you also own another specific limited 5-star character. In this case, Llama from the previous version. The issue here goes deeper than team building. It is the perception that a character's full potential is now locked behind a second, separate paywall. This effectively doubles the cost for anyone who wants to play this new character at her best, leading to a lot of friction with players on a budget or who are free to play. It prompted a very blunt but accurate reaction from many, and of course myself. Lock it behind a limited 5-star, goddammit. Genshin never changes.
So you called out Genshin for synergy gating, for demanding more and giving less, and you gave more to get less! Links in the description for this. I'm not kidding. He makes the exact same Columbina finally taking center stage quote in both the 6.1 and 6.2 video. You're literally complaining about the same kind of team building restrictions. You are complimenting the same lore drops in the trailer. It is borderline the same video, which is probably a better explanation for the burnout than 6.1 being dry. Every time a new version comes out, you have to say the same thing as before, but with some different characters. And we're not even at the point that people are memeing on with this shit. Until now. This is the tweet. The one people have been memeing to death. And to be fair, it's a very funny format. I'm sure some of you can tell that I'm having fun with it if you've been paying attention, which, fuck doubling down, man. If you're standing on business with your feelings on this, own that shit. I've turned plenty of jokes made at my expense into full-blown running gags. Boonslayer.spreadshirt.com. But in his explanation video, he does talk about the response to that tweet, and, well, unfortunately, there's some more dishonest argumentation that I noticed.
But among the garbage, there was one tweet that actually sparked a real conversation. A few days ago, I asked a simple question. How do we feel about locking combat buffs behind a story quest? And the response was loud. People accused me of hating RPGs, of wanting to turn the game into a spreadsheet simulator, and of missing the depth that story adds. Let me be clear, I love the story. I love Venti. I have been following the lore since day one. My favorite Genshin creator is a lore channel. But there is a difference between story and homework. When you lock a fundamental combat fix, like making Albedo's flower usable, behind a yap fest of dialogue for a character I might not care about, that isn't depth, that is a time tax. If I have to sit through, God forbid, 40 minutes of official yapping just to unlock a passive ability for my team, that quest stops being a narrative experience and starts being a barrier to entry.
Okay, so first of all, Official's actually one of the longer ones, and it's still only like 10 minutes. And it's kind of got an important lore reveal about Official being... But, yeah, if you don't want to use Official, fucking don't. You have options that are, and this is true, not Official. I thought you were complaining before about it being required to pull Durin. If you're not going to use Fischl in your Albedo team anyway, then fucking don't. Yeah, that's not the big problem with what's being said here, but I kind of wanted to point that out real quick. Sorry for interrupting. Please continue yapping for 40 minutes.
It becomes a burden, and the idea that a real RPG don't let you skip is just false. Look at Baldur's Gate 3. It is arguably the greatest RPG of the decade. It has a skip button. Even visual novels like Doki Doki Literature Club have a skip button. Asking for a skip button isn't about hating the writing. It is about consent, right? 2025, consent is so good. It is about respecting the players enough to let them engage with the parts of the game they love and bypass the part that they don't. I want to watch Venti's quest because I care about Venti. I love him, but I don't want to be held hostage by a side quest just to fix my character's kit. Like, who cares about Mona? I mean, you do probably. I don't.
See, this is where the dishonest argumentation comes in, because you may as well be Jimmy fucking Graham with how you're moving the goalpost. Like, admittedly, it's a little subtle, but you're using the criticism that's generally agreed with. Genshin should have a skip button for dialogue-heavy scenes in order to shift what you were saying to be from locking buffs behind quests to locking buffs behind unskippable cutscenes. You want to skip the dialogue for characters you don't like and watch dialogue for characters you do. I get that. Of course it would be better for the game, but you're painting it as though you were talking about a skip button the whole time when nothing in your tweet indicates that you were talking about the skip button, but the presence of a quest wholesale, which is a fucking contradiction to your love of Wuthering Waves, by the way. Hey, chat, Kuro locked Spectro Rover's Frazzle application behind playing the Black Shore story quest. How do we feel about this? Hey, chat, they locked Havoc and Arrow Rover behind the main story. How do we feel about this? Hey, chat, they locked all Rover sequences behind story progressions. How do we feel about that? Hey, chat, they locked Flight behind getting to Renacida in the story. How do we feel about that? Hey, chat, they locked Flight in Huang Long behind a different quest. How do we feel? Do you see how inane that sounds when you put it out of context? But then again, I guess that ignores the context of your view on Twitter as a whole, doesn't it?
And while we're on the subject of casuals and tourists, let's talk about Twitter. I saw the threads. I saw the essays of people calling me a casual, which I probably am, I guess, analyzing my emojis, and trying to diagnose my personality based on 280 characters. Now let me save you some time. I do not take Twitter seriously. I treat that app like a public bathroom wall. Half the time I'm trolling, and half the other time I'm barely paying attention. If you are writing a thesis statement in my replies, trying to own me based on a shitpost, the joke is not on me, it is on you.
Which is, of course, why people posting fucking memes on a take that was a little bit bad was enough to spark conversation with you. Like, that's all you show on screen. You treat Twitter as rage bait, and apparently no one else does? Just you? But this isn't all you have to say about Twitter on this video. In fact, I should backtrack to the beginning of the video for this one.
And usually when a content creator goes into a situation like this, the instinct is to double down, to make a clapback video, turn up the saturation, and start a war to farm engagement. And if you follow me on Twitter, you know that is exactly what I've been doing over there. I have been fanning the flames and laughing at the backlash because frankly, seeing people lose their minds over blatant rage bait tweets was funny to me. But here on this channel, I am not doing that. Because while Twitter is a circus, this channel is where I actually care.
Right. This isn't the platform where you're starting a war for engagement. What was the video before this one again? Oh, right. The one I talked about at the beginning where you were talking about people making up excuses to dislike Wuthering Waves on Twitter. Now, you don't take Twitter seriously. Well, not when you're posting anyway. If someone else is posting there, then it's serious enough to be covered on the platform you take seriously. You take it seriously enough that in that video, you call someone not having Twitter Blue and making a Twitter post as something that makes them more dishonest. Now, I don't give a fuck if you have an editor making this joke instead of you. You still greenlit the shit. And by the way, you don't have it either. By the way, nice #1 Gotcha Gamer tag too, Who. I didn't even fucking dislike Glaive. I still don't. But this went from addressing where you made an oopsie with what you were saying and, you know, still having some stuff I disagreed with, but can easily be chalked up to differences of opinion without being so bad to just be egregious the more I even so much as touch it. And I'll be damned if I'm gonna let some drama whore wannabe dollar store Danny Trejo, as in wishes he was the dollar store Danny Trejo, that low on the totem pole, be the last word on this shit. There's an element that this all comes down to that I could make a whole video about and have expressed my dislike for in the past. And that's the whole gacha tribalism that seems to be especially bad with Wuthering Waves and Genshin Impact gnashing at each other if the horse game isn't involved because Game Awards nomination. I'm someone who enjoys both games. And if you want me to be truthful, I actually think Wuthering Waves is better. But I think treating anything that isn't your gacha game as though it's dog shit is so fucking primitive. And treating anyone who prefers the other gacha game over yours is also a fucking license to print ass in my eyes. Anyway, I'm liking getting notified about my upcoming videos behind clicking the subscribe button and hitting the bell. So you know. Subscribe or I'll blow up your house like Connor.